may I present Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld.
Thank you, Gary, for that beautiful introduction. It's true that I did address the first CHIO convention back in 1984. I was 12 years younger then, as we all were, and many of your children weren't even born. So you see what's happened to this incredible movement, this homeschool movement throughout the United States. And last weekend I was in Florida, in Orlando, addressing the Florida homeschoolers, and one of the people there gave a kind of history of the homeschool movement, and he said that back in the early days, at the very beginning, for example, when CHIO was started, Gary and his family were the pioneers. And then a couple of years later, we began to get the settlers, and they filled the movement. And now we're getting the refugees. So welcome to the homeschooling movement, because, believe it or not, it's probably the most important social phenomenon in America today. It is the wave of the future, because really we have no choice. They're not giving us any choice. See, the educators are not going to reform the system. They're not going to go back to basics. What they're planning are such radical changes that are so contrary to everything America stands for that the American people will simply not put up with it. And the only recourse they will have will be to actually remove their children from the schools, because the educators will not change. Now, there is a bit of movement in the field of reading. That is, they're beginning to have a great many second thoughts about whole language. So there's a movement to get back to phonics, but that's still rather problematic, because you've got all of these thousands of teachers who were taught whole language in their schools of education, their universities, and they have to be re-educated. And we don't know how that is going to be done or whether it is going to be done. And of course, there's tremendous resistance on the part of those educators who want to continue to teach children to read in the manner that has produced such horrendous reading failure in America. So, yeah, there is a little bit of change there, but this is a revolution that's going to be really carried out by you people. And that's why homeschooling is so important for the future of America. You know, it's remarkable when immigrants come to this country, I think they must detect that there's something very different about the American people, because we have a history of general distrust of government. I mean, the founding fathers distrusted the British government that ruled here, the king, etc. As a matter of fact, our Civil War was fought because of a growing distrust of the federal government on the part of the southern states. That's why they seceded. They refused to go along with what they considered to be an incredible intrusion on their own state laws. And so we've had this continuous conflict in the United States of the people versus the government. And because the government owns the public school system, there is where you're seeing the battle being waged more fiercely than ever before. And at the heart of the change, however, at the heart of the battle, is this cultural struggle, this religious struggle, this spiritual struggle, that is of trying to move America from a nation under God to a nation under man, you see. And that is really at the heart of the struggle. And I think that Ken Ham made that very clear yesterday in his keynote address, how the other side has used the issue of creation and evolution as the means to undermine America's adherence to the Bible. And his advice is very good. That's where we must stand. We must stand on the Bible. You know, it was very early in our history that it was recognized how important religion is for America. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French historian who visited America in the 1830s, wrote, quote, "Upon my arrival in the United States, the religious aspect of the country was the first thing that struck my attention. And the longer I stayed there, the more I perceived the great political consequences resulting from this state of things. In the United States, the sovereign authority is religious." See, that's true. When this country was created, it was created by men who believed that God was the sovereign over all. God was the sovereign over the civil government, the church, and the family. The civil government was not sovereign over the family. God was sovereign over these three forms of government. De Tocqueville continues, he says, "There is no country in the world where the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America. And there can be no greater proof of its utility and of its conformity to human nature than that its influence is powerfully felt over the most enlightened and free nation of the earth." I mean, why do so many people want to come to America? It's because of the kind of government that was founded by these believers. He goes on, "Christianity therefore reigns without obstacle by universal consent. The consequence is, as I have before observed, that every principle of the moral world is fixed and determinate." The absolutes, fixed and determinate. "The safeguard of morality is religion, and morality is the best security of law as well as the surest pledge of freedom." That's so true. There was a time in this country when people didn't have to lock their doors at night. They didn't have to lock the doors of their cars, of their Model T Fords. But you can't do that today, because in those days the religious morality was our greatest security. It isn't so any longer. He says, "Not until I went into the churches of America and heard her pulpits flame with righteousness did I understand the secret of her genius and power. America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great," unquote. How true that is. I mean, if we're slaughtering 1 million unborn children every year, that's not good. You can't say America is good when we're doing that to our unborn children. Well, things have changed a great deal. What we are seeing now in America is that this benevolent state, in which biblical law set the moral standards of American society, has been changed greatly. Today, what we have in America is the subordination of society to bureaucratic law, the law of the state. Yet these laws were enacted by the legislators we elect. But too many of these legislators no longer believe in the primacy of biblical law. They believe that man's law is superior to God's law. Now, we call that philosophy humanism, and that's the philosophical foundation of liberalism. Liberalism is really humanism. They're interchangeable, basically. As a matter of fact, liberalism is the political expression of the humanist philosophy, which started, by the way, in New England very early in the history of this country. And it was humanism that took over Harvard University back in the early 1800s. In those days, it was called Unitarianism, but the Unitarians created humanism. Humanism, liberalism goes under many guises. It's called progressivism, socialism, collectivism. No matter what you call it, its most significant principle is its rejection of God as the true sovereign over our nation. And of course, this has serious consequences for the family and for education. Humanism is an organized, religious, philosophical movement dedicated to the overthrow of Christianity. The humanists declared war on Christianity in 1933 with the proclamation of its Humanist Manifesto. I don't know how many of you have read the Humanist Manifesto, but it's a small booklet. It's available, in many places. But it has the entire humanist program. It's there for anyone to read and see. And this is what that manifesto states, among other things. Quote, religious humanism maintains that all associations and institutions exist for the fulfillment of human life. The intelligent evaluation, transformation, control, and direction of such associations and institutions with a view to the enhancement of human life is the purpose and program of humanism. Certainly, religious institutions, their ritualistic forms, ecclesiastical methods, and communal activities must be reconstituted as rapidly as experience allows in order to function effectively in the modern world, unquote. In other words, the humanist program calls for taking control of and transforming all of the cultural and religious institutions and associations of the nation so that they will be made to effectively advance the humanist agenda. Now, there's no other religion in America that calls for the taking over of everybody else's religious institutions. Can you believe it that the humanists believe that they have to take over your institutions and transform them, as they said? Transformation, control, and direction of such associations and institutions. That's what they've been doing. They've been taking over the schools, the churches, the universities. They're all in their hands now because they believe that that's their purpose. That is their program. They declared war on you. Now, we are supposed to be living in a society where religious freedom is respected by all religions, but we have it in the words of the Humanist Manifesto itself. The intention of humanists to reconstitute everybody else's religious institutions, rituals, and ecclesiastical practices to conform with humanist goals. I subscribe to a leading humanist magazine called Free Inquiry. And this particular issue, in spring 1996, is on religion in the public schools. And of course, they've been working on secularizing America for years. And then in this particular article, the writer writes, he says, the hard work of secularizing America is at most a third done. They say it's only a third done, and I think we're about as secular as you can be. But he says it's only a third done. I wonder what they're going to do in the next two-thirds, you see. He says, out of step with today's popular temper as it may be, peace among the faiths in a polycreedal America is going to require nothing less than the radical de-Christianization of public life. The public square must be stripped so bare of religious references that Americans of all faiths can occupy it in comfort and with realistic expectations of equality. No tradition can remain that suggests a dominant Christian majority is simply showing tolerance for the benighted adherents of other creeds. The alternative is the near certainty that America's public institutions will become battlegrounds between Christian traditionalists and new outsider militants. So they know that this is a war. They've been waging it for years. And most Americans, most Christians have been asleep at the switch, not even realizing that there's a war being waged against them. Now, this man is so convinced that they've got to get rid of Christianity, religion from the schools, that he writes that in 1992, Williamsville, New York, an upscale suburb of Buffalo, unveiled an ambitious plan to strip its public schools of long-established Christian and Jewish trappings during the holiday season. It had adopted this plan independently, voluntarily, without threat of suits or orders from some education commission. Educators and parents simply responded to their own perceptions of growing diversity. The plan was far-reaching. There were to be no Christmas trees, no holiday assemblies, no hallway decorations, not even a winter concert. Predictably, conservative Christians howled in protest and railed about sterilization. Equally predictably, the 1993 school board elections turned into a church-state catfight. Christian candidates struggled to unseat incumbents who had supported the plan. The Christian coalition got into the act, flooding the community with voters' guides. The result? Williamsville's non-Judeo-Christian professionals became politically involved, got out the vote, and returned by comfortable margins every one of the incumbents responsible for rejecting Christmas and Hanukkah from the schools. That's how they work. That's how they operate. You get a few Christians elected to school boards in tiny towns, and that becomes national news. The fact that all of these school boards are in the hands of the humanists and the liberals is not worthy of coverage in the press. It's a stated fact, but should any Christian decide to become a member of a school board, that becomes national news. It may be a town of 3,000 people, but that's enough to get on the front pages of the national press, you see. And what happens immediately? They have a recall. New election. The NEA gets out its people, and of course the Christians are then expelled, and the school boards are back in the hands of the liberals and the humanists. Nowhere has the philosophical conflict between humanism and Christianity been better explained than in Dr. Rousas J. Rushdoony's classic book, The Messianic Character of American Education. For it is in the field of education that the conflict has raged most intensely. It should be noted that one of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto in 1933 was John Dewey, father of progressive education. Dr. Rushdoony shows that humanism not only threatens Christian education, but educational freedom in general, because there is a link between religious liberty and educational freedom. Americans are slowly becoming aware that spiritual and morally, education is basically a religious function, even when it is atheistic. And Christian education is hardly viable without religious freedom. As Dr. Rushdoony writes, quote, among Nietzsche's manuscripts after his death was found a slip of paper on which he had written these words, since the old God has been abolished, I am prepared to rule the world. This is the meaning of humanism's inescapable totalitarianism. Total government is a necessity, and everything in man requires it. If there is no God to provide it, then man must supply it. And you can see the totalitarian trends in everything that is presently being done in Washington by the bureaucrats, the education bureaucrats, in the creation of the data-gathering computer system that will centralize a collection of data about every single individual in the United States. And you see it, of course, in everything now that is being done, supposedly in the name of education reform. Dr. Rushdoony continues, in the United States, the efforts of federal and state governments to control churches and Christian schools are the logical results of their humanism. There must be sovereignty in law, and it must be man's, not God's, is their faith. Clearly, we are in the basic religious war, and there can be no compromise nor negotiation in this war. Humanism seeks to abolish the God of Scripture and rule the world. And that's so true. I mean, I quoted from the Free Inquiry magazine, the Humanist magazine. All you have to do is read the Humanist magazines to see how seriously they take this war. That is the Humanist, Free Inquiry magazine, and other publications that the Humanists put out. I mean, if you want to read real anti-Christian literature, that's where you'll find it. In America, the ultimate aims of humanism can only be achieved through the control of children and their education. The fundamental issue, therefore, is the ownership of children. Do humanists have the right to indoctrinate children in the public schools with humanist values without the knowledge or consent of the parents? They're doing it every day without your consent. And Dr. Rushdoony writes on this issue, quote, "The first and basic premise of paganism, socialism, and Molech worship is the claim that the state owns the child. The basic premise of the public schools is this claim of ownership, a fact some parents are encountering in the courts. It is the essence of paganism to claim first the lives of the children, then the properties of the people," unquote. Now, there are many cases in which compulsory school attendance laws have been used to deprive parents of their children. These are insidious laws, the compulsory school attendance laws. We've got to get rid of them if we're going to restore educational freedom and parental rights. The most egregious case I know of is that of Barry Bear, an 18-year-old youth who has spent the last 5 years in state custody in Iowa because of truancy. Barry's mother, Anna Bear, is a white woman married to a Native American with whom she has had 4 sons and a daughter. The family lives on a reservation near Tama. Barry is mildly retarded and has what the public schools like to call special needs. But like many retarded children, Barry suffers from a variety of ailments, mainly gastrointestinal. And so when it came to attending school, Barry was absent a great deal. However, that should have not bothered the school, since Anna Bear taught school for 20 years, was certified, and could teach Barry at home. So mother was a certified teacher. However, in May 1989, the Iowa Supreme Court ordered that Barry, then 12, be forced to attend school. His parents refused. And so in 1991, after a long court battle, Barry was removed from his home and placed in foster care. Taken out of his family, perfectly nice family. I have visited them. I know them. Removed from his family. He's been in 4 or 5 foster homes. I've lost count by now. 4 or 5 public schools in which he's learned how to tie his shoelaces, but not much else. They did this because they said they wanted him to get a good education. So they taught him how to tie his shoelaces. He is presently at a residential hospital where he is being drugged and has now become addicted to these drugs. This mild, gentle boy has become a violent young adult who wants to go home. He doesn't want to be locked up in a residential hospital. He's beyond the age of compulsory school attendance, yet they insist on keeping him there. The state will not let him go home. He is now their prisoner. And even though he has reached the age of 18, the court refuses to release him. Why? Because they own him. And they want every homeschooler in Iowa to know that they own him and that every other child they own every other child they can get their clutches on. See, the state believes this and the courts are helping them out. And we know why. We know exactly why this occurred. The Des Moines Register of January 12, 1989, carried the following small item under the heading of State House Briefing. Quote, Iowa prosecutors are seeking more power to intervene in truancy cases and have suggested law changes that could give county attorneys more tools to use against fundamentalist Christians who want to teach their children at home. Recommendations from the Iowa County Attorneys Association include a change in the state's juvenile code to add truancy to the list of reasons officials can start proceedings that can lead to removing the child from the home or to terminating the parent's rights to their child, unquote. Well, what could be clearer than that? And they're using Barry Bear as their court case. Every decision made by the court which enhances the state's power to hold this individual a prisoner of the state of Iowa. Here's a child who hasn't committed any crime, who has been deprived of his home life now for all of these years, deprived of the love of his family, is being kept a prisoner by the state of Iowa, has been drugged by them, has been turned into an addict by them in the name of education. And Iowa is part of the United States. Thus, the humanist state can legally kidnap any child it wants through the compulsory education laws and keep that child prisoner for as long as it wants. I hope that no such thing happens here in Ohio. I hope that you keep a very, very close watch of what your officials are doing when they are trying to deal with the homeschool movement. I think, however, that the movement now has grown so large and so powerful, there is less likelihood that they can do in Ohio what they've done in Iowa. Iowa seems to be one of the most vicious, tyrannical states when it comes to homeschooling. You wouldn't expect it of a nice Midwestern state, would you, that they would impose this kind of tyranny on parents? But that's what we're dealing with. You have to understand that the humanists mean business. They're not playing games. They intend to enslave this country. Whatever they want to call it, I could just call it slavery, that's all. And which means that the issue of Christian liberty can only be resolved in a philosophical confrontation between Christians and the state. I say philosophical confrontation, not a physical confrontation, since the government has shown little restraint in its handling of citizens who disagree with its laws. You know, it's very interesting that the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, spent months planning their so-called dynamic entry of the compound, David Koresh's compound in Waco. They knew that there were men, women, and children in that building, and yet they were working to get tanks, helicopters, machine guns, a small army of ATF operatives. They were planning that for months. For what reason? Because they suspected that David Koresh and some of his followers had broken some arms laws, some very minor infractions. These were minor infractions. Well, do you get tanks and planes and automatic weapons and a small army of people and practice dynamic entry before you've even knocked on the front door to ask, may we come in and inspect? See, that's the mentality of our bureaucrats today. You have to understand that they are well on the road to totalitarianism. We haven't been aware of it. Waco woke us up. Waco told us that these, our so-called public servants, are ready to wage war on us, the American people. They're planning it. They even lied to the Army. They told the Army that there were suspicions that there were drug activities going on in that compound, and therefore they needed tanks. Tanks to serve as subpoena or a summons to court for violations which were no more dangerous than traffic violations. So this is what you're dealing with. You cannot, I say you don't confront a government that's half crazed with power. Apparently they learned something of a lesson, and we see how they behaved in Montana a little differently. Somehow they're learning something. In other words, you don't confront this crazy government physically if you want to survive. As long as this civil war can be fought in the courts and in the polling booths and by the legal actions of its citizens, there is no reason for physical confrontation. Our goal must be the recognition of God's sovereignty over this nation. The principle of God's ownership was implicitly understood by the founding fathers who wrote the U.S. Constitution and upheld God's sovereignty over man. George Washington, in his inaugural address in 1789, after being sworn in as first president of the United States under the new Constitution, said, such being the, quote, such being the impression under which I have, in obedience to the public summons, repaired to the present station, it would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplications to that almighty being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand that conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. We ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. And since the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered as deeply, perhaps finally, staked on the experiment, unquote. See, George Washington believed that God was sovereign over all. And it was God who permitted us to create, or permitted them to create, this great nation that we have. See, that's why in the new history standards put out by the humanist educators, Marilyn Monroe gets 6 pages and George Washington gets very small mention. That's the kind of thing that's happening. That's what they want to do to your children. Fill their minds with garbage. Thus it was very clearly understood at the very birth of the American Republic that God's sovereignty ruled over the United States, and that as long as the civil government remained subordinate to God's sovereignty, it was legitimate and thereby supportable by Christians. But the introduction of secular, government-owned and controlled schools and colleges began to erode that basic understanding in the minds of the American people. Statism, the philosophy that the state is the supreme power, slowly absorbed the loyalty of America's academic elite. And if you want a history of how all of that developed, you ought to read my book, Is Public Education Necessary? Because in that book, I wanted to find out why Americans handed over the responsibility of education to the government so early in our history. And you will see that in the earliest days of our country, education was virtually totally private. You had common schools in New England, but they were locally controlled. Local people hired the teachers, chose the textbooks, and paid the expenses. You didn't have that centralized control from the state capital or from a Department of Education that we have now. And it's very interesting how Americans were persuaded to give up that control over the education of their children and hand it over to the state. But if you want a good narration of that history, my book has it, Is Public Education Necessary? It had nothing, the change had nothing to do with economics or literacy. It was all philosophical. And so you have to understand the philosophical basis of this battle, this struggle that has been going on since the very beginning. You will find that those people who were pushing for the public school movement, even in those early days of the 1830s and 40s, were determined to get God out of education. That was their goal for most of them. Later on, when the Protestants came in and joined the movement, they did so because of their fear of the Catholics. Catholics were immigrating to the United States in huge droves, and the Protestants feared that there would be, the Reformation would be overturned. And so they got on the bandwagon. But the whole movement was started basically by the Unitarians, by humanists, by socialists, to get God out of education. And they've succeeded. Slowly but surely, the concept of religious freedom gave way to that of religious toleration. The original concept of religious freedom meant that the state had no jurisdiction over the church, its schools, or its affairs. But the new doctrine of religious toleration meant that the state granted certain privileges to churches and religious schools at its own pleasure. Privileges such as tax exemption, which could be withdrawn at any time the compelling state interest required it. Dr. Rushdoony writes, quote, "The fact is that religious liberty is dead and buried. It needs to be resurrected. We cannot begin to cope with our present crisis until we recognize that religious liberty has been replaced with religious toleration. We may be able to live under religious toleration, but it will beget all the ancient evils of compromise, hypocrisy, and a purely or largely public religion. It will replace conscience with a state license and freedom with a state-endowed cell of narrow limits. This is the best that toleration may afford us in the days ahead," unquote. The basic philosophy of statism and religious toleration has important ramifications for the Christian family. Dr. Rushdoony writes, quote, "In Scripture, the family is the basic institution of society to which all the most basic powers are given, save one, the death penalty. Hence, the death penalty could not be executed on Cain. The family is man's basic government, his best school, and his best church." It's the earliest form of government. Remember, the family preceded the creation of the church. It preceded the creation of civil government. It's the first form of government. It's the most lasting form of government. And it's the form of government that people retreat to when the civil order is falling apart. People return to the family. That's your first social unit. And that's why the humanists have done everything in their power to destroy the family. And they've taken aim at the single person who is the most important spiritual individual in that family, the father. They've undermined the father's role. They've denigrated the role of the father. The father has been lured into the playboy philosophy, away from his family. And that's how they've managed to destroy so many American families, so that now you have so many single mothers who must hold down the fort, keep a sense of order, while the fathers are philandering. That's the tragedy, but it's all been done by our culture, as you can see. Dr. Rushduni continues, he says, to review briefly the basic powers which Scripture gives to the family, the first is the control of children. The control of children is the control of the future. See, that's why the humanists want to control the children. They want a humanist future. And they've got to control Christian children. And that's why it is so dangerous to put a Christian child in a public school, because the humanists are going to work overtime to de-Christianize that child. Dr. Rushduni goes on, he says, this power, that is the control of children, belongs neither to church nor state nor to the school, but only to the family. Second, power over property is given in Scripture to the family. God gives control of property into the hands of the family, not the state nor the individual. Third, the inheritance in Scripture is exclusively a family power, governed by God's law. Fourth, welfare is the responsibility of the family, beginning with the care of its own. Fifth, education, a basic power, is given by God to the family and its power and responsibility. As its power and responsibility. The modern state claims the right to control and provide education, and it challenges the powers of the family in this area too. Humanistic statism sees control of the child and the family as basic to its drive toward totalitarianism, unquote. I think you can sense now why the homeschooling movement is so important to America during this time of cultural civil war. The means to restore Christian liberty and constitutional government are limited by the very circumstances of the battlefield. The battlefields in this civil war are to be found in the courthouses, the legislatures, the media, and most important of all, in the actions that citizens can take to further the cause of freedom and godly government. You see, you still have the freedom of your children's education. And if you don't take advantage of that freedom, you're going to lose it. I mean, the humanists realize that they cannot destroy, stop the homeschool movement, because that would tip their hand. All Americans would realize what this is all about. So they can't afford to do that. They hope to control you by some other means. As they take fuller control over the government and the government's education system, they are creating a system that's going to make it very difficult for homeschoolers to participate in the economy. Because in the new school-to-work programs and reforms, they are going to link employment to education. So that if you want to get a job, you're going to have their certificates, which will force homeschoolers back under their control. They're going to use very clever means to get you back. They'll give you free computers. They'll lure you with all kinds of goodies. Don't worry, they're working on it. I've read their papers. I've read their plans. They're well aware that they cannot let you be free. In a totalitarian society, everybody's got to be controlled. Everybody, including you. They've got to have you on their computers as well. And so they're planning ways to get you back, or get you back under their control. But as long as we still have that freedom, you've got to use it. You know, as the saying goes, use it or lose it. One of the most important actions families can take is to remove their children from the government schools and homeschool them. By now, about 1 million families have made that choice, and their actions have had an accumulative effect on American life that is only now beginning to be felt. I mean, now almost everybody knows somebody who's homeschooling. You know, it isn't any longer this strange form of activity. While the government asserts implicitly in court decisions here and there that it owns the children, it cannot say so explicitly to the public at large for fear of provoking a violent reaction. And so school districts subtly assert that state ownership principle by requiring parents to request permission to homeschool and requiring homeschool children to be tested. Some school districts require more and some less, depending on the disposition of the superintendent. But in some districts where humanist superintendents refuse to acknowledge parents' rights and impose onerous conditions for homeschooling, parents have had to fight in court to defend their God-given right to educate their children as they see fit. Despite the obstacles involved, the withdrawal of children from the humanist state system is significant because it means that those children will be free from statist, humanist indoctrination. It means that the Christian family will be free to raise its children in a godly way, in a way that conforms with the principles and values of the Founding Fathers. These are the children who will mold America's future and restore God's sovereignty over our government. And from a demographic point of view, that can very easily happen because the Christians are having large families. I mean, it's not unusual to find Christians with more than 5 or 6 kids. While the humanists, they usually have 1.5 children, you know. And they're killing off the rest anyway, you know, through abortion and etc. So Christians have a good chance of, in 10, 20 years, of outpopulating the humanists. What is also so important is what the homeschool movement is doing for the Christian family. Homeschoolers are rediscovering the benefits and joys and blessings of family life. For it is in the family that love for one another and love of God is nurtured. The very act of educating one's own children is a godly act called for in Deuteronomy, and therefore it brings the Christian family in obedience to God's law and reestablishes the family as a unit governed under God, equal to the civil government. American civil government was never meant to usurp, replace, or negate family government. That's what you've got to assert. That under God's law, family government is equal to civil government. You're not subordinate to civil government. You're equal to it. Of course, we're all under the same criminal statutes. If parents do criminal things, they can be prosecuted, as well as even when members of the civil government do criminal things. And now we're seeing in Washington some very interesting things happening with members of our government who are engaged in illegitimate activities. And the very threat that a president may be deposed, we've already had one deposed, but we may have another president deposed because of illegitimate or criminal activity. The civil government must respect family government, for they both derive their legitimacy from the same divine source. But today's civil government has done all in its power to make the family totally subordinate to the state by taking control of the children through compulsory attendance laws and using state social agencies to undermine the integrity of the family. We must get rid of compulsory attendance laws. We have to. The reason is very simple. They are using those laws against us. At first it was said, oh, we must have compulsory attendance laws because if we don't, parents won't send their children to school. Well, there was a time when we didn't have such laws. And you know that 95% of the people put their kids in school regardless of whether there were such laws or not. In fact, in Mississippi, they repealed the compulsory school attendance law some years ago, and it didn't change anything as far as the numbers of kids in the schools. But then they reinstated the compulsory school attendance laws. Not because families were keeping their kids out of school or because kids were staying out of school. They reimposed the compulsory school attendance laws because they wanted to reimpose their power over the family, their legal power over the family. That was the sole reason. Had nothing to do with children being in or out of school. It is true that dysfunctional families pose a problem for society. But in the past, it was the church or private agencies that dealt with such problems. Today, when the state takes control over a family, it plays the role of God. Social workers place children in foster homes that sometimes turn out to be worse than the homes they were taken from. That's been the case in Massachusetts, where we've had horrible stories of foster children actually killed, murdered in foster homes, beaten to death. And of course, drug addiction and unwed teenage motherhood has exacerbated the dysfunctional family problem. Detached from God, these people become the victims of their own innate depravity. But we should not lose our freedoms, and parents should not lose their rights simply because a portion of the population acts irresponsibly and self-destructively. We cannot expect the drug addicts and unwed teenage mothers on welfare to save our country, nor should we let them prevent us from doing what has to be done to restore America as a nation under God. And so the homeschool family is on the front line of this civil war, and we can only win this long, drawn-out war one family at a time. The quiet revolution is taking place right under the very noses of the humanists, and there isn't much they can do about it. You know, what's really ironic is even some of the humanists are beginning to homeschool, because they realize they want their kids to be able to read too. So, believe it or not, the Unitarians have a homeschool organization now. And public education is their religion. The Unitarians have, this has been the heart and soul of their religion has been government education, and yet even some of them are deserting it. Meanwhile, the homeschooling family is creating a revolution in American family life. The Christian family that lives in obedience to God sets a standard of morality that will stay with their children for the rest of their lives. That even some homeschool children may go astray is inevitable. Don't believe that homeschooling is the cure-all for everything. Your children are human beings, and some of them may go the way, as we say, the way of all flesh. But, knowing what we do about human nature. But the vast majority are becoming the kind of citizens we can all be proud of. And so the reconstruction of the American family is one of the great benefits of the homeschool movement. The homeschooling family creates a generation bridge instead of a generation gap. Parents can pass on to their children their spiritual and moral values, thereby creating family continuity into several generations. As was pointed out, it only takes one generation to get back to primitivism. One generation of not teaching the children the basic biblical morality, and you get to the barbarians that are now pouring out of the public schools. Why do you think we have children committing such heinous crimes? Children committing these heinous crimes. The public schools are now producing a generation of young barbarians. It's as simple as that. Homeschool children learn to respect their parents' intelligence. And the parents who know their children better than any stranger could enjoy teaching their children. I myself have no children, but I've always thought that one of the greatest pleasures of parenthood must be the act of instructing one's own children in what is good and valuable, showing them what a wonderful world they were born in, what a wonderful God we have, who has given us life and inspired our founding fathers to create a country of such great freedom. What a joy it is to introduce a child to poetry or great music and art, or to the wonders of nature, or to playful puppies and kittens, or to horseback riding, swimming, ice skating, and heaven knows what else. Gee, that's the joy of parenthood, I would believe. The joy of being able to raise children in the way that you would like to see them grow, and to introduce them in all of these marvelous things. Did you know that homeschoolers learn better than public schoolers? Wherever homeschoolers have taken standardized achievement tests, they've come out ahead of the public schoolers. Why? Because the home is a better place to learn than a school. One-on-one teaching is more effective than the classroom. Also at home, the preschoolers learn from their older siblings. They can't help but learn because they hear it and see it all around them. And did you know that homeschooling parents learn more than their children? Quite an interesting phenomenon. Many parents don't realize that when they begin teaching their children math or grammar or history or a foreign language, they are also learning these subjects. In fact, because homeschoolers generally use phonics to teach their children to read, they improve their own reading skills by learning the phonics they didn't have when they were in school. Most of today's young homeschooling parents were taught to read by the Dick and Jane look-say method and were deprived of the kind of intensive phonics necessary to become a good reader. Thus, learning phonics through teaching it to their children has been enormously beneficial. And I know that for a fact because many parents have told me that. Another important benefit of homeschooling is that the home is a safe haven for the children in a world awash with drugs, sexually transmitted diseases, violence, and moral corruption. Children need all the protection they can get. If you want a child to get involved with drugs, send him or her to a public school, the principal marketplace for drugs in America. That's where peer pressure is used to hook a child. If you want your child to become suicidal, just give him a good dose of death education. You know, have him write his own obituary and visit cemeteries and funeral homes and that sort of thing, which is done in death education. If you want your child to become sexually active, just give him or her explicit sex education, beginning in kindergarten with instructions on how to use a condom. If you want your child to lose his religious faith, just subject him to endless lessons about evolution, critical thinking, which means criticizing your folks and your religion. You see, that's what critical thinking is all about, to question absolutes, the absolutes of the Bible. And they use the dialectic technique to do it. And before you know it, your child has been turned into a non-believer. All they need is one lesson in evolution to do it. One lesson in evolution can undermine your child's complete belief in the Bible as the inerrant Word of God. That's all it takes. If you want your child to start putting rings through his nose and safety pins in his eyebrows or navel, send him to a public school where his peers will persuade him of the beauties of self-mutilation. I think the reason why so many kids are not putting rings through their nose is because they're being prepared to be led by the nose, you see, into the New World Order. Homeschooling provides healthful socialization, not the negative kind you get in public school. In homeschooling, brothers and sisters get to know one another very well, and they become lifelong friends. In the public school, brothers and sisters go their separate ways, bonding with their own clique of friends, engaging in mischievous behavior, drinking, smoking, dating, getting high, listening to acid rock music, having sex. Homeschooled kids get to know other homeschooled kids. Their Christian code of morals determines their behavior. They believe in courtship, not dating. They are future-oriented, planning to have long, healthful, productive lives. The public school teenager lives for the moment, the thrill, the party. Otherwise, they are bored, hanging out at malls or parking lots, killing time before going home to surly parents who ask them, "Where'd you go?" The answer is nowhere. "What did you do?" Nothing. Typical conversation of today's public schoolers and parents. But perhaps the greatest dividend that homeschoolers enjoy is the taking back and mastery of their own time. Time is one of the most precious commodities a family has, and the more time a family can devote to its own improvement and enjoyment, the better it is for all of its members. Public schools squander the best time in a family's life. You know, they take the best time that you have. They steal your children and they steal your time. And what do you have? You have whatever is left over. Whatever is left over is for you to enjoy or to use, you see. Yes, and they do squander the time, because we know that out of the full school day, about 45 minutes is actually devoted to learning something. And it's usually learning the wrong thing. Yes, the public schools rob the family of the time that could be spent together learning, playing, and creating. The state wants that time in order to do its work of indoctrination, but that time belongs to your family, and once you reclaim it, you can use it in the ways that you see fit. Another development among homeschoolers is their political awakening. They know that they must get more God-fearing men in the Congress and the state legislatures. They made quite a difference in the elections of November 1994. You must become politically active and stay politically active, for the other side would like nothing better than to get politicians in power who will vote to make homeschooling illegal. That's what the NEA is doing, National Education Association. And the Democrats and all of these people who look down on homeschoolers, they want to get more of their people in the state legislatures so that they can pass laws outlawing what you're doing. I think you get the gist of what I am driving at. You are very important to America's future. More important than you will ever know. You are the revolutionaries doing God's work, one family at a time. You know, I look at, and each one of you, as you withdraw your children from the public schools, creates another vacant spot, another vacant seat in that school. And I look forward to the day when the public schools will be virtually empty. Not because we have abolished public education, but because the parents, for the most part, will have abandoned it. Yes, there will be those who will send their children to the public schools out of ignorance or indifference or a misguided loyalty to an institution that no longer works. But the taxpayers may decide that keeping the public schools open for that diminished group is uneconomical and simply provide the families with tuition to attend private schools. Who knows, we may yet see such a day in the not-too-distant future. So that's what we have to look forward to. It's really all up to you. It's all up to the American people how all of this is going to be played out. Whether the other side is going to prevail or not, they still have hopes that they can prevail because the power is in their hands. The power still remains in their hands, and you are giving them billions of dollars every year in which to exercise that power. All of their power comes from your money, taxpayers' money. You support the schools of Ohio. You support the U.S. Department of Education. You support the educators who are trying to do everything in their power to bring you under their control to create this socialist, totalitarian society which they've been working on for all of these years. Everything we have today has been long planned and been worked on. These plans did not just arise out of nowhere. This is long range. We're in it for the long haul. I'm pleased to see that the movement has grown as greatly as it has over the years. The homeschool movement is developing not only in Ohio but in every state of the union. And I can assure you that it's going to become even stronger in the days ahead as the educators try to impose this new human resources development system in the schools, and that the children will be then trained like little animals to serve the government and to serve the economy. That's what's happening in the United States. That's what outcome-based education is all about. And of course, the dumbing down will continue, even though that there is a move to get back to phonics. Most of the schools are still using whole language, and they will persist in that because that's part of their agenda. They have to dumb down the American people. How can they enslave us if we can read our own Declaration of Independence, if we can read the Constitution, if we can read the Bible? See, so they've got to dumb us down to the point where, we can read at a comic book level. That's about it. So that the elite can rule us. You know who the elite is. Those people at the top, Hillary and Billary, and friends, half of whom are now being indicted for one thing or another. It's very interesting. If you're an FOB, a friend of Bill, you either wind up dead or in jail. These are the typical elitists who want to control your life. And when you read what they write, and when you see how these organizations that they create to manipulate everything, you understand that this is a band of people who have no morality, no religion, no respect for Christianity, and they are determined, as Dr. Rushdoony said, to impose totalitarianism. They have no choice. You see, once they get on this road of control, they have to control everything. They have to control everything and everyone. And that's why that they have created this centralized computer in Washington that's going to have records on everybody. Everybody. All this data gathering will be done by computer. You see, now they feel that they can do it much better than the Russians because the Russians didn't have all of this computer technology. So they feel that with the computer technology, with all this information about every individual in that centralized computer, they will be able to control everybody because they will have information about you, and they will be making decisions about every child's education and every child's future, because the government will now be planning everybody's future. That's what this school reform is all about. And that's why we must not only defeat it, but we must get away from this steamroller, this engine toward totalitarianism and statism. So it's up to you. It really is up to you to fight this battle, as I said, one family at a time, to do the best you can to become politically involved, to vote for people who believe in parents' rights. Ask every candidate, what is your stand on parents' rights? What is your stand on homeschooling? Every candidate, ask every candidate that, to make sure that the people that you elect, the people who get into the Congress and the state legislatures, understand what's happening and understand what you want, and understand that God's sovereignty must be restored over this nation. That's the big problem. God's sovereignty must be reestablished so that The family, the church, and the civil government are all equal. The civil government must never be permitted to rule over the family and the church in this country, because that's the end of America. Then we become like every other country. So we must reestablish God's sovereignty, and that can only come about by the reconstruction of our families and the reconstruction of Christianity. See, this liberal infection of Christianity has undermined all of this. And that's why we must restore orthodoxy, absolutism, the belief in the inerrancy of the Bible, because that should be our standard. That should be the foundation on which we build everything. That's the foundation on which this nation was built, was created. And if we don't restore that, then we're going to lose everything. And it's up to you to do it. It can only be done by you and your families. So I want to wish you Godspeed. I want to wish you the best in all that you do. I want to wish you an excellent homeschooling experience. I've never had any complaints from homeschoolers that they didn't like what they were doing. Of course, you can always send your kids back to the public schools if you're so inclined. I doubt that you will do that, though. But you are really the wave of the future. And I want you to encourage you to be proud of what you are doing,